The letter was supposed to be simple, one page, sealed with the Aldenmore crest, addressed to the Royal Courier Office, handed off by a servant, and forgotten by morning. But the family's only servant had slipped on the kitchen steps and sprained his wrist, and Lady Aldenmore needed the letter delivered before the courier office closed, and Vivian had already spent 2 hours having her hair pinned and could not possibly be asked to walk anywhere, and so the task fell, as most tasks fell in that house, to Alara. She did not complain. She never did. She pulled on her plain gray coat, tucked the letter into her satchel, and walked the 4 streets to the Palace District in the thin autumn light, the kind of light that makes ordinary things look briefly important. The courier office was quiet when she arrived. A clerk sat behind the counter, sorting packets into wooden trays. 2 officers in plain riding clothes stood near the window, talking in low voices. Alara approached the counter, set the letter down, and gave her family's name and address for the receipt. The clerk stamped the log, tore a slip, and slid it across the counter. She picked it up. She turned to leave. One of the men by the window looked up, not at her exactly, at the letter, at the address, at her handwriting in the margin, where she had corrected the postal district notation in pencil because her mother had written the wrong one. She did not see him look. She was already out the door by then, walking back through 4 streets of thin autumn light, already thinking about the household accounts that still needed balancing before supper. That was all. That was the whole encounter. She would think about it later and decide it was nothing, because nothing in her life had ever trained her to believe otherwise. Alara Aldenmore was 22 years old and had been invisible for most of them. It was not a cruel invisibility. Her family was not unkind. Her mother was a woman of strong ambitions and limited imagination, which meant she poured every hope she owned into the daughter who looked like what she had always pictured. Vivian was that daughter. Vivian was tall and fair and moved through rooms the way expensive things move through shops, making everyone else feel slightly underdressed. She had been presented at court at 18. She had been admired at 19. She was now, at 23, the subject of her mother's increasingly focused matrimonial campaign, because hope is a thing that curdles when it waits too long. Alara was the other daughter, brown-haired, quiet, the kind of pretty that only announced itself in good light and then seemed faintly apologetic about it. She had not been presented at court. The expense, her mother had explained, was not practical when Vivian's own presentation was still producing results. The explanation made sense. Alara had nodded and gone back to the ledgers, which she managed because she was better with numbers than anyone else in the house, and because no one else wanted to do it. She did not think of herself as overlooked. She thought of herself as useful in a different direction. That was the version she had agreed to. The season of court presentations arrived that year with the particular enthusiasm of a thing that has been delayed. The king's eldest son was now of marriageable age, and the nobility was participating in the annual fiction that this was a social event rather than a transaction. Lady Aldenmore had been preparing Vivian's wardrobe for 3 months. 2 new gowns had been commissioned. A dance instructor had visited on Tuesday afternoons. Alara had sat in on the first lesson to take notes on the footwork, because Vivian forgot the turns, and then somehow ended up demonstrating them, because she had watched carefully, and her feet remembered what her sisters did not. The night of the first great ball, Alara stayed home. She sat at the writing desk in the study with the household accounts open in front of her and a cup of tea going cold beside her hand. The house was very quiet. The sound of her pen was the loudest thing in it. Outside, 4 streets away, the palace would be bright and loud and full of people being looked at. She was not unhappy. She had told herself this so many times that she had almost forgotten she was still telling it. She refilled her tea. She finished the accounts. She balanced the columns, which gave her a satisfaction that was clean and real and entirely her own. Then she put the ledger away, turned down the lamp, and went to bed. She did not think about the man in the courier office. She did not think about the way he had looked at the letter. She did not know, yet, that he had found out which house the letter came from before he left the building. She did not know that he had stood on the street for a moment afterward, turning that information over in his mind the way a person turns a coin, testing weight, testing edge, deciding whether to spend it. She slept without dreaming. Vivian came home near midnight in good spirits, with a small stain on her glove from the refreshment table and a name she said twice at breakfast, a Lord something from the northern counties who had asked her twice to dance. Lady Aldenmore asked clarifying questions about family income in a way that she imagined was subtle. Alara poured the tea and listened and said nothing, because she was good at that too. 3 days passed. The accounts were balanced. The larder was inventoried. Vivian had 2 more events to attend and a new pair of gloves to replace the stained ones. On the 4th day, a note arrived at the house. It was not addressed to Vivian. It was not addressed to Lady Aldenmore. It was addressed, in a formal and unfamiliar hand, to Miss Alara Aldenmore. Her mother held it for a long moment before handing it over. The expression on her face was the expression of a woman rearranging a room in her head and finding that one piece of furniture she had forgotten about was larger than she remembered. Alara took the note. She opened it at the breakfast table, because she had no reason to do otherwise. Inside was a single sentence. "I believe you made a correction that was not asked for. I would like to know if you make a habit of that." There was no signature. There was no name. There was only a small seal pressed into the wax at the fold, a seal she recognized after a moment, because everyone in the kingdom recognized it. The House of Ravelstone, the wealthiest duchy in 4 provinces, the most discussed name in every drawing room, every court corridor, every letter her mother had ever written to a social connection, a name that meant money so old it had become boring, power so established it had become furniture, and a duke so consistently unmarried that the kingdom had developed a small industry of speculation around it. Alara read the sentence again. She set the note down on the table next to the teapot. She looked at her mother's face, which had gone very still. She looked at Vivienne's face, which had gone very confused. Then she picked up her tea and drank it, because her hands needed something to do, and because she had not yet decided what she thought, and until she decided what she thought, the safest thing to do was nothing at all. "Who sent that?" her mother asked, in a voice that was trying very hard to be calm. "I don't know," Alara said, which was not entirely true, but she was not ready, yet, to say the rest of it out loud. She folded the note. She put it in her coat pocket. She went back to the accounts, which needed checking again, and she sat at the writing desk for a long time without writing anything, listening to the house breathe around her and trying to remember the last time anyone in it had wanted to know her opinion about anything at all. She could not think of a single time. She pressed her thumb against the seal in her pocket and thought about a man who had looked at a correction in the margin of a letter and found it interesting enough to track down. She did not know what to do with that. She filed it. She would examine it later, alone. Outside, the thin autumn light was doing its trick again, making ordinary things look briefly important. She wondered, for the first time in a long time, whether she might be one of them. The news arrived at the Aldenmore household not as a rumor but as a fact that had already finished happening before anyone thought to warn them. His Grace the Duke of Ravelstone would be attending the season. Not the season in the abstract, in the way powerful men sometimes graced events with their distant presence and then left before the dancing started. He would be attending specifically and intentionally, which meant the hostesses of every significant event in the calendar immediately began rewriting their seating arrangements. The tailors reported a sudden surge in orders for new coats, and Lady Aldenmore sat down rather heavily in her chair and pressed her fingers together in the particular way she had when she was calculating. Cassian Ravel had not attended a full social season in 7 years. The last time he had, he was 26 and still performing the obligations of a young duke finding his footing. He had danced the required dances, spoken to the required families, and then one morning had simply stopped doing all of it, as if he had reached a conclusion the rest of the room had not been consulted on. He managed his estates from Ravelstone Hall and appeared at court twice a year for official business and went home again, and the kingdom had spent the better part of 7 years deciding what this meant. The most popular conclusion was that he was waiting for something specific. No one agreed on what. Lady Aldenmore, who had an extraordinary ability to fold reality into whatever shape suited her plans, immediately decided that whatever he was waiting for was about to present itself in the form of Vivienne Aldenmore. She began the campaign that very afternoon. A dance instructor was rehired. A third gown was discussed. Vivienne was spoken to seriously about poise, about the importance of listening as much as speaking, about how a woman of genuine quality allowed a man to feel that he was being understood. Vivienne listened carefully and then asked, reasonably, whether anyone actually knew what the Duke was like. Her mother told her that men of that standing were all fundamentally the same, and that the approach was the approach. In the kitchen, Alara stood at the counter, reviewing the week's grocery list, and heard all of this through the open door and said nothing. She had written a reply to the note. It had taken her 4 attempts. The first 3 had been too long. The 4th was 2 sentences. I do make a habit of it. Corrections tend to matter more than the people who need them want to admit. She had sent it that morning with the regular post. She had not told anyone. That evening, another note arrived. This one came not by post but by private courier, a young man in Ravelstone livery, who handed it to the door and left before anyone could question him. Lady Aldenmore intercepted it in the hall. She read the outside, saw Alara's name, and held it with the careful neutrality of someone who very badly wanted to open it and had enough self-control not to. She handed it over at dinner. Alara opened it after the meal, in the privacy of the study, with the door closed. This one was longer. 3 paragraphs. He had written about the Eastern trade dispute, a subject that had been dominating the court's attention for 2 months. A complex argument about tariffs and routes and which provincial governor stood to lose what. And he had laid out his own position clearly and then written, at the end, "I suspect you have a different view. I would be interested to hear it." Alara sat with that for a while. It was, she recognized, an unusual thing to offer, to a woman he had never spoken to, in a kingdom where women's opinions on trade policy were generally treated as charming accidents. She wrote back. She disagreed with him on 2 of his 3 points and told him exactly why, with specifics, citing the numbers she had seen in the merchant reports she helped file for her father's old business contacts, which she still maintained out of habit and because nobody had thought to cancel them. She expected silence. She expected, perhaps, a short polite note that closed the correspondence with appropriate courtesy. Instead, he arrived. Not by announcement. Not by the formal protocol of a duke calling on a family of consequence. He appeared at the Aldenmore front door on a Wednesday afternoon in a plain coat and no retinue except for 1 aide standing at a distance, and he knocked, and when the door opened, he said he was here to speak with the Aldenmore family. Lady Aldenmore was at his side in under a minute, which was remarkable given that she had been on the 2nd floor when he knocked. Vivian was found and presented. The drawing room was opened. Tea was produced at a speed that suggested the kitchen had been on standby. Cassian Ravel was not what any of them had pictured. He was 33, dark-haired, with the kind of face that was more striking than handsome, a strong jaw, a way of looking at things that suggested he was always solving a problem related to whatever he was looking at. He was not charming in the way they had expected. He did not perform warmth. He spoke correctly, acknowledged the pleasantries, drank his tea without commenting on it, and listened to Lady Aldenmore describe Vivian's qualities with the attentiveness of a man who is waiting for a different conversation to begin. Vivian, to her credit, was excellent. She was composed and interesting, and said everything correctly. Alara sat on the far end of the settee, a little behind and to the side, because there was no chair for her in the configuration her mother had arranged, and she was used to finding a place in the margins. He looked at her once, early in the conversation. Just a glance. She looked back. It lasted less than 2 seconds and communicated nothing in particular. Then, about 20 minutes in, he asked Lady Aldenmore a question about the East Province tariff reports and whether she had any access to the older merchant filings. Her mother blinked. "That is a rather specific subject for an afternoon call," she said carefully. "I have rather specific interests," he said. There was a pause, and then, from the far end of the settee, Alara said, "The merchant filings from the last 4 years are incomplete. 2 of the southern routes were never formally logged because the governor at the time was reporting selectively. If you're trying to build a full picture of the trade flow, you need to cross-reference the port records from Halden." The room went quiet. Not because what she said was shocking. Because of the way she said it, the way a person says something they know to be correct and have known for a while, and have simply been waiting for someone to ask the right question. He turned to look at her fully, no longer a glance. "You have access to the Halden port records?" he asked. "My father maintained a correspondence with the Halden trade office until he died. I kept it going. It seemed wasteful to let it lapse." A pause. "Your father has been gone for how long?" 6 years. He said nothing for a moment. Then, "You have been maintaining a professional correspondence with the provincial trade office for 6 years, unprompted, in case it became useful?" "Yes." "And has it?" "Not until now," she said. He looked at her for another moment. Then he said, to Lady Aldenmore, that he appreciated the visit, and thanked them for their time. He stood. He shook the appropriate hands. He was at the door before Lady Aldenmore had fully processed what had just happened. At the door he paused and looked back into the room. Not at Vivian. Not at Lady Aldenmore. "The Halden port records," he said. "I would like to see them, if you're willing to share." He said it to Alara. Clearly, in front of everyone. Then he left. The drawing room held its breath for a full 4 seconds after the door closed. Then Lady Aldenmore turned to look at Alara with an expression that had not yet decided what it was. Vivian looked at the door, then at her sister. Then she said quietly, "He didn't look at me. He looked at you," Alara said carefully. "Not like that." There was no good answer to that. Alara did not try to manufacture one. She sat with her hands in her lap and listened to the house settle around her, and tried not to examine, too closely, the feeling that had settled somewhere in her chest without asking permission. It was not excitement. She refused to call it that. She called it, instead, a point of data. A small correction in a margin. Nothing, yet, to draw conclusions from. He called twice more in the following 2 weeks. Both times formally, both times the tea was produced and the drawing room opened and the polite structure of a social call observed in full. Both times the conversation found Ilara and stayed there. He asked her about the port records, which she had organized and annotated with notes. He read her notes in front of her and asked follow-up questions that suggested he had thought about her previous answers between visits. Lady Aldenmore began visibly adjusting her calculations. She was a practical woman. She could see a thing clearly when the evidence became heavy enough. Vivian said nothing more about it. Once, crossing paths in the upstairs hall, she touched Ilara's arm briefly and then kept walking. And Ilara stood there for a moment, understanding something that neither of them was ready to say out loud. At the end of the second visit, after her mother had been drawn into a separate conversation with the aide he had brought this time, he spoke to Ilara quietly, standing near the window. "You assumed," he said, "when this correspondence began, that you knew what it was." "I assumed several possible explanations," she said. "I arranged them by likelihood." "And the most likely one?" "That you found me briefly interesting, and would lose interest when the novelty ran out." He considered that. "What is the second most likely?" "That you were genuinely curious about the trade records and were using correspondence as a convenient access method." "And third?" She did not answer right away. When she did, she kept her eyes on the middle distance, not on him. "I stopped at 2. A short silence. Then he said, "You should have kept going." She said nothing. He did not press. He did not explain. He let the sentence sit in the air between them, and moved back toward the room before her mother returned. Ilara stood by the window for a moment longer. Outside, the season had moved on from autumn, and the light was different now. Flatter, cooler, offering fewer illusions. She thought, the most dangerous thing about this man was not his wealth or his name, or the way a room organized itself around his presence without being asked to. The most dangerous thing was that he seemed to be paying attention to her the way she had always paid attention to everything else. Carefully, consistently, and without any obvious need for a return. She did not know what to do with that kind of attention. She had never had to develop a defense against it, because she had never encountered it. She pulled her coat straighter and went back to the room. She did not allow herself to look at him again for the rest of the visit. She was afraid of what her own face might say. The kingdom had a system for managing things that did not fit its expectations. The system worked like this. If something irregular appeared, it was discussed, considered, gently questioned, and then either absorbed into normalcy through reframing, or quietly pressured until it became something easier to manage. This system had been operating smoothly for generations. It handled minor scandals, unexpected alliances, inconvenient births, and impolitic marriages with the same measured efficiency that it handled everything else. Cassian Ravel's apparent interest in Ilara Aldenmore was, to the kingdom's social machinery, an irregular thing. The first response was disbelief, which lasted approximately 4 days. The second was reinterpretation. Perhaps the calls to the Aldenmore house were really about the elder daughter, and there had been a misreading. The third, once it became clear that there had been no misreading, was the organized production of opinion. The opinion came from everywhere and said, essentially, the same thing in different accents. She was the wrong daughter. She had no presentation, no position, no public standing. She was a private girl from a respectable but unremarkable family who managed household accounts and maintained obscure trade correspondences, and had never been seen anywhere of consequence. A Duke of Cassian Ravel's standing, his wealth, his history, the expectations his family name carried, did not choose that. The opinion was delivered in letters, in drawing-room conversations, in pointed remarks at shared social events. One countess wrote to Lady Aldenmore directly, in language that was technically concerned but functionally competitive, suggesting that there might be a misunderstanding and offering, generously, to help clarify the situation. Lady Aldenmore read the letter twice, set it down, and said nothing to Ilara about it. 2 noble families with unmarried daughters submitted a joint inquiry to the court social secretary, asking whether the Duke had made any formal declaration of intent, citing, as their concern, the stability of the season's arrangement. The secretary's office responded that no formal declaration had been made. This was true. It did nothing to relieve the pressure. If anything, the absence of a formal declaration meant the situation was still open, which meant everyone still had a position to defend. A duchess of the oldest family in the capital, old enough that her opinion carried the weight of established weather, wrote a letter to a mutual social connection describing Alara in terms that were careful and complete and devastating in their thoroughness. The letter covered bloodline, visibility, preparation, and something the Duchess referred to as established social readiness, which was a phrase that meant nothing specific and everything general. The letter was passed along, as such letters are, and eventually a copy reached the Aldenmore house. Alara's mother read it and went very quiet. She gave the letter to Alara that evening without any introduction, setting it on the writing desk beside the ledger and leaving without explanation. Alara read it once, from beginning to end, without changing expression. Then she folded it carefully, squared the edges, and placed it inside the front cover of the ledger under the tab she labeled, in her neat handwriting, "Outstanding debts, theirs." She did not discuss it with her mother. She did not cry. She did not spend the evening rehearsing arguments. She went to bed at a reasonable hour and slept adequately, and in the morning she rose and had breakfast and answered, by post, a question the Duke had sent about the third-quarter shipping volumes through Halden, and she answered it with the same precision she brought to everything, and she did not mention the letter. 2 days later, he appeared at the Aldenmore door again. This time there was no tea. He had come early, before the formal hours for calling, and he stood in the hallway with his coat still on and asked if he could speak with Alara. Not the family. Alara. Her mother took longer than usual to produce a reason why that could not happen in the study with the door open, and in that longer than usual pause, Alara came down the stairs and said that the garden was accessible and they could speak there if he preferred. He preferred. The garden was small and brown with late season, its beds cleared for winter, its 3 trees standing without their leaves. They walked along the near path and he said nothing for a moment, which she was learning was his way. He did not fill silence. He used it. She walked beside him and waited. "I want to ask you something directly," he said. "And I want a direct answer, not a managed one." "All right," she said. "What do you think is happening here?" She kept walking. "I think you're a man who became interested in a correction in a letter's margin and followed the thread to see where it led. And where did it lead? To me, which I imagine was not what you expected." "No," he said, "it was not." A pause. "I expected to find a clerk, or an unusually literate servant. I did not expect to find a woman who has been managing a serious correspondence, reading trade policy, and balancing a household's finances for 6 years, in a house where none of that was required or rewarded." Alara stopped walking. She turned to look at him properly, because this seemed like a moment that required it. "What you found," she said, "is someone who does useful things because they need to be done, and no one else is doing them. That is not a remarkable quality." "You would be surprised," he said, "how remarkable it is." She looked at him. He looked at her. The garden was very quiet around them, and the flat winter light was coming through the bare trees and making everything look like a sketch waiting for color. She said, "You should know that there are at least a dozen letters in circulation right now saying I am entirely unsuitable for whatever this is." "I know. They are not wrong about the facts," she said carefully. "I have not been presented. I have no position at court. I have no particular standing. The facts they are citing are accurate." "The facts," he said, "are not the argument." "Then what is?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The argument is that suitability is a word that describes what a person looks like from the outside. It has nothing to do with what they are." Alara held that sentence. She turned it over carefully, the way she turned over accounting columns, looking for the error, the place where it collapsed. She could not find one. "I am not easy," she said. "I am not agreeable in the way that women of my position are usually expected to be. I notice things that are wrong and I say so. I will not stop doing that." "I know," he said. "It is the first thing I noticed about you." She looked away. She looked at the 3 bare trees and the cleared beds and the wall at the garden's end, and she thought about a word she had been refusing to use for several weeks now because using it would require her to be wrong about something she had believed for a very long time. The word was seen. Not admired. Not wanted for what she could produce or manage or arrange. Seen, as in, noticed, specifically, as herself, with all the corrections included. She said, "I don't know what to do with this." "Neither do I," he said. "Not precisely, but I find that I want to continue figuring it out." She looked back at him. He was not performing anything. He did not look like a man waiting for a particular response. He looked like a man who had said a true thing and was comfortable letting it stand. She said, "I will think about it." "That is all I'm asking," he said. They walked back inside, Her mother's face, as they entered through the back door, was an entire novel in a single expression. Elara did not read it. She went upstairs and sat on the edge of her bed and pressed her hands flat against the quilt and breathed for a while. She thought, "This is the most frightening thing that has ever happened to me. Not because it was bad, because it was not. Because it was real and specific and aimed at her exactly. And she had spent 22 years building a life inside the expectation of not being aimed at, and she did not know, yet, whether the walls she had built were protection or prison." She sat there for a long time. Then she went downstairs, opened the ledger, and checked the accounts. They balanced. They always balanced. It was the one thing she had always been certain of. She thought, perhaps that is enough to start with. The Grand Autumn Gathering was held every year at the Crown Hall, an enormous building that had been extended so many times by different monarchs with different aesthetic convictions that it no longer had a single clear style. It was simply everything, accumulated, which somehow made it feel like the kingdom in miniature. Every family of any standing attended. Every unmarried daughter above the age of 17 was present and aware of being present. Every mother had done a calculation. Every father had reviewed his finances. The event was social in its format and mercenary in its function, and everyone participated with the complete understanding that they were doing both things simultaneously, and the dignity of the occasion required pretending otherwise. Elara was there as Vivienne's companion, which was a status that existed in that particular social geography. Close enough to attend, not formally enough to be announced. She wore a dress that was respectable and plain and had been borrowed from a hook in the back of Vivienne's wardrobe, and she stood near the east wall of the second reception hall where the light was good and the crowd moved at a manageable pace, and she watched things. She was good at watching things. She always had been. She watched the room organize itself around its own hierarchies, the titled families near the large windows, the merchant-class newcomers working the perimeter, the court officials clustered near the refreshment tables. She watched the social calculations happening in real time, the conversations that were invitations, the conversations that were negotiations, the conversations that were simply people performing the act of enjoying themselves for the benefit of everyone watching. Vivienne moved through it well. She had always been good at this, the easy grace of someone who had been trained for it and happened to also be naturally suited. She smiled at the right moments and listened at the right moments, and kept her opinions at a moderate and pleasant level. Elara stayed near the east wall and observed and drank a small glass of something sweet that she had taken from a passing tray, and thought, as she sometimes did, about what it would feel like to be the person in the center of the room rather than the east wall of it. She had never figured out whether she actually wanted that or had simply noticed its absence long enough that the noticing had become a habit. He arrived late. She felt the moment before she saw it, a shift in the room's attention, the kind that happens when something of significant weight enters and the air rearranges itself. She looked toward the main entrance and saw Cassian Ravel come through the doors in a dark coat, alone except for one attendant at his left shoulder. The room did not stop. It adjusted. Conversations continued but subtly angled themselves toward the entrance. Heads turned with varying degrees of social artfulness. Two women near the far fireplace touched each other's arms and said something. He spoke to three people near the doors, a brief word to the court secretary, a handshake with a lord whose province shared a border with Ravelstone, a nod to one of the senior trade officers that lasted slightly longer, and she recognized from 40 feet away that he was collecting information, not socializing. Then he moved. Not toward the dais where the titled families stood, not toward the cluster of young women who had, collectively and without coordination, shifted slightly to become more visible, not toward the refreshments or the court circle or any of the obvious destinations. He moved toward the east wall. She watched him come. She did not move. She had the irrational thought that if she stayed very still, the moment might not happen, and she was not sure yet whether she wanted it to happen here, in this room, in front of 300 people who were all watching him move and beginning, collectively, to understand where he was going. He stopped in front of her. He was not performing anything. He looked at her the same way he looked at everything, directly, specifically, with the clear impression that he had already thought about this and arrived. "You're near the wall," he said. "I find walls useful," she said. "You can see the whole room from one." "What do you see?" "Everyone watching you walk over here." He glanced, briefly, at the room, then back at her. "Does that concern you?" She considered the question honestly. "Ask me again in 10 minutes, she said. Something shifted in his expression. Not a smile exactly. More like the shadow a smile throws in advance of itself. "I need to tell you something," he said. "Then tell me," she said. "You have always been direct. Don't stop now." He was quiet for a moment, in that way he had. using the space before he spoke, not filling it. Around them, the room had done the thing rooms do when something of real consequence is happening in one corner. It kept going. All the noise and movement and social performance continuing, but a portion of its attention was here, pressed gently against this particular stretch of east wall. He said, "I came to this gathering for one reason." She looked at him and waited. "I am not practiced at doing this in a way that is small," he said. "I do not know how to be indirect about things that matter to me, so I will not try." "I appreciate that," she said. He said, "I would like to declare my intention, formally, to you, now." The east wall of the second reception hall of the Crown Hall was not a quiet place. It was 40 feet from an orchestra and surrounded by 300 people and decorated with 2 enormous arrangements of winter flowers that were shedding petals onto the floor at regular intervals. It felt, in that moment, as though someone had removed all the sound from it. Ilara held his gaze. She felt, somewhere in her chest, a complicated and inconvenient feeling that she could not file under any of the categories she usually used for filing things. It was not excitement. It was not fear. It was something more specific than either. The feeling of standing at the edge of a thing you have always suspected you deserved and being offered, now, the chance to agree with yourself. She said, "Before I answer that, I need to ask you one thing." "Ask," he said. She looked at him steadily, the way she looked at a ledger column when she was checking it, precisely, without sentiment. "Do you know what you are choosing, or only what you want?" The room breathed around them. Somewhere near the far fireplace, a woman set down her glass. Near the dais, 2 men paused in a conversation. The orchestra moved from one piece to another, and the transition took a moment to establish itself, and in that thin gap between one piece and the next, he said, quietly enough that only she could hear, "I know exactly what I am choosing." A pause. Then, "I have known since the margin of a letter." She breathed, once, steadily. Then she said, "Yes." The word was small. It was the smallest word she had ever said that meant the most. She did not dress it up or qualify it. She gave it to him plainly, the way she gave everything, directly, without performance, without the apology her whole life had trained her to attach to the things she wanted. He did not move immediately. He let the word stand. He treated it the way it deserved to be treated, as something real and deliberately given. Then he offered her his hand, not to lead her somewhere, not as a gesture toward the room, simply his hand, open, available, unhurried, waiting. She looked at it. She thought about 22 years of east walls and household accounts and corrections made in margins that no one was supposed to notice. She thought about a woman in a letter who had listed everything she was not. She thought about a folded page in a ledger under outstanding debts, theirs. She put her hand in his. The room did not erupt. There were no gasps, no dramatic proclamations. What happened was quieter and more permanent. The room took it in. It absorbed the fact of her hand in his hand and reorganized itself around it, and became, from that moment, a room in which that was true. The countess who had written the letter about suitability stood near the central fireplace and said nothing. The 2 families who had submitted the inquiry to the court secretary were present in the room and were very still. The social secretary, a man who had seen a great many things in 30 years of his position, wrote a small note in the margin of his event log. Vivian stood near the dais with a glass in her hand and watched her sister, and after a moment she pressed her lips together in a way that had nothing to do with regret and everything to do with the specific relief of watching someone receive what was always supposed to be theirs. Lady Aldenmore, who had arrived near the dais and was watching from a distance with her hands clasped and her expression arranged, began, in the privacy of her own mind, immediately taking credit. Ilara did not look at any of them. She looked at her hand and his hand, and then she looked at him, and she thought, "This is the first time in my life that someone has crossed a room for me." Not the room her mother arranged, not the room that was built around Vivian's presentation and her careful training and her silk and her grace. This room, this enormous, gilded, crowded room in which she had been standing near the east wall, exactly as she had always been, except that tonight someone had looked at every option in the room and walked the full length of it to stand beside her. The orchestra settled into its new piece. The conversations resumed. The room moved around them as rooms always do, continuous and indifferent and alive. She was still standing near the east wall. She had not moved. But the east wall was different now. She was different now. Not because a duke had chosen her, not because the room had witnessed it, or because the countess was silent, or because the ledger in her head had balanced in a new and unexpected way. Because she had answered. She had said the word. She had put her hand in his without apology, without qualifier, without first checking whether she was allowed. She had, for the first time, taken the correction she had always known she deserved and written it in her own margin. Outside the Crown Hall, the autumn had turned fully to winter. The streets were cold and clear and very quiet, and the east wall of the building faced out over a small courtyard where nothing remarkable was growing, and nothing was watching, and the night was exactly as ordinary as it had always been. Inside, a woman stood near that wall with her hand in someone's and let herself, finally, be found. She had not been rescued. She had not been lifted from obscurity, or salvaged from invisibility, or transformed by someone else's attention into a better version of herself. She had been recognized, and recognition, she understood now, standing in that room with the orchestra playing and 300 people quietly revising their understanding of how the evening had gone. Recognition was the only thing she had ever needed. The correction had always been there. Someone had finally read it. That was enough. That was everything. She was not the girl nobody wanted. She was the girl that nobody had thought to look for. And she had been found.